Hi, welcome back to my channel. This is Red Ibis Coach. My name is Heather. My business is called Red Ibis Coaching. My channel is called Red Ibis Coach. Confusing? Maybe, but that's just how I'm doing it, and I'm stubborn in not changing it for now. I have a master's in applied psychology, in coaching psychology, and positive psychology. And today is the last video that I'm doing in my limited series on workplace well-being for women of color in Ireland. I thought I would summarize everything that I've been talking about in a format that clearly shows what the process was for the design. I really want to highlight some of the women of color and the allies of researchers who have worked to create any literature on this topic, whether it's for psychology or not, and just give you some of the positive psychology overview things that you might be interested in knowing about. So I'm going to try to make this as minimally academic as possible. I'm not trying to ruin your life with something boring. I'm trying to make this something that just gives you food for thought, really. So here we go. This table of contents is a little bit different because I eliminated some of the preliminary data because that is private information that I only had permission to share that in the actual dissertation and within the confines of the university. So you won't see that, but a lot of the other stuff is the same. If you notice the thing in this picture, one of these pictures that's not right, well, that's your business. So, really, the background on this, why I decided to do it, it was solution driven because of the scarcity of data for the experiences of women of color in the Irish workplace, the scarcity of data for women of color and positive psychology interventions, also known as PPIs. And how could we fill that gap? Only with research. So here's some of the literature that I believe is really important. The Linehan and Sheeran, The Black Ceiling, that really set me on a path to have a better understanding of what I would want to focus on in the research. I really recommend that paper, and that's from 2023, so very recent. Of course, intersectionality comes up a lot in my research in this paper. Intersectionality, if you don't know, was originally coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it talks about the multiple ways that people can be discriminated against and marginalized and oppressed in a society based on their identities. So if you think about a woman, because of the patriarchy, women are less given less resources and seen as adding less value to society than men. So that's one layer of discrimination that changes their experience of the world. Adding more and more marginalized identities, more and more intersections of identity adds to oppression. So if you're a Black woman, if you're an Asian woman in a predominantly white society, you have being a woman of color. So those are two ways that you can be oppressed in a society. If you add other things like a queer identity or having a disability, then we've got multiple ways that you can be oppressed, and those can layer on top of each other, and it can make work more difficult, but also life in general. It just creates more social friction. So I was prompted to develop a research question, and the research question I chose was, how do women of color in Ireland experience workplace well-being? And can a strengths-based PPI improve this experience? That's just the way that I had to structure the question. If it had been up to me, I would have done it a little bit differently. But in order to meet all the requirements for my area of study, which is positive psychology, I had to get specific like this. Here are my methods. I've talked about it before. It's not interesting to everyone, but basically, there was a quantitative component and a qualitative component. I wanted there to be some self directed activity, and I wanted the women to have their answers from the assessment. The reason that I did that is because I wanted people to have their data. So it's not only about me extracting data from people and then using it in a way that they can't do anything with it. This study was really designed so that the women could see what their answers were for the strengths test. What is it called? Brief strengths test. Have those answers, have them for themselves, know what they got for their strengths, and then the strengths based intervention, which was a daily reflective journaling activity based on an activity of their choice. So they did an activity of their choice and then they wrote about it. So I wanted to give them some agency within the research, within the study. So it's not just a process of extraction, it's a process of education and giving tools that can be useful to people. So taking something, making it your own, that was really what it was all about to me. And then in the semi-structured interview, we talked about the test, we talked about the strength test, we talked about how it felt to do the activity, and we went pretty deep in a deep dive of how does work feel for you. So I mentioned this before, but the main component, the one that I actually analyzed and put into my dissertation, was the PERMA profiler. So as you can see, PERMA is the model within positive psychology that stands for positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. And then there are additional questions that cover health, loneliness, negative emotions, and overall well being. And this is one of the ways that you can use a psychometric test, this one in particular, to see what somebody's well being levels are. The brief strengths test was self scored, which means people chose their answer and then noted it. So if you look at the example here, an example of an item from the measure, which means like what does a question say? One example was think of actual situations in which you had the opportunity to do something that was novel or innovative. How frequently did you show creativity or ingenuity in these situations? The person would choose their answer, and that would tell them that that is a strength if they chose an answer that is leaning that way. So basically, once they go through the test, they would note, like, the test told me that I have creativity or ingenuity, or the test told me that I have a love of learning. And the participants could note that for themselves and keep that data. And I didn't necessarily process that data. I wasn't testing for women's strengths. I was testing for their well being levels. But I wanted them to have access to something that they could learn something for themselves and take that information and use it, which is why it is called self scored. For the qualitative is the story, the lived experience part of data. Usually, a research study is one or the other. It's either qualitative, like the assessment, or it's either quantitative, like the assessment, or qualitative, which is semi-structured interviews or journaling. I chose both because I wanted a lot of work to do. I think that is obviously a joke. I think I chose both because I was like, we're going to get really different answers in the moment. when someone just did the activity versus in the interview when they're thinking about the activity weeks later and might not remember their experience. In order to get the in the moment and the overall sense, it was good to have both. And really, truly, the semi structured interview was digging and drilling into workplace well being specifically, the experience of that specifically. And as you can see here, you can see my approach to the analysis and my epistemological lens. Deal with that what you will. If you are interested, go on a little rabbit hole journey, see what you think of those theories. So, what were the implications? Strengths-based PPIs, positive psychology interventions, are anecdotally impactful, but as we are starting to finally admit, they don't counteract systemic inequities. Feeling good in a moment is not going to make you feel better at your job. Though if your job is structurally racist, you won't feel good while you're working there. And positive psychology interventions can lower or decrease the harm, but they cannot eliminate them. They cannot eliminate it. Strengths-based interventions do need further testing with marginalized groups because workplace well-being is a multi-layered issue, and marginalized groups are historically and just unfortunately still to this day left out of research that they should be included in. Positive psychology as a discipline, of course, because it's new, it still has literature gaps that must be addressed, because when you're aiming to understand how identity and belonging impact PERMA, we're not there yet. Also, racialized people are already, which I've said in both of my other videos, trying to counteract racism. They're already embodying positive psychology. And because positive psychology is saying, we have all the answers, you take them and you have the wisdom, instead of saying, what do you do to feel good? And studying that wisdom, that lived wisdom, there's still work to be done. Reflexivity. So in thematic analysis, which is the qualitative story analysis, lived experience analysis, reflexivity is the researcher's obligation to deconstruct and analyze their own lens of the world. So for me, as a woman of color, I can understand to a certain extent the experiences of other women of color. However, I have never worked in Ireland and I am not Irish. So I'm both an insider and an outsider. I do, as a US citizen, as someone who was born and raised in the United States, have a high sensitization to racial inequity. I am sensitive to any inkling that something is not right, that something is happening in a society, and I felt it when I was in Ireland, but it wasn't overt the way it can be in the US. Again, you could see in the epistemology of my research that I have an anti-racist decolonial mindset that I'm using to analyze the data. So I'm saying what's happening here from a perspective of deconstructing racism and colonialism. And then research as reciprocity. So this is something that I covered more in the write-up of my dissertation. I didn't talk about it a lot in the presentation of the dissertation, but I do see research. I think research should be reciprocal in some way, not just me taking data, but giving back in some way. So the way I did that was to say, here is information about yourself that has nothing to do with me. I'm not using it, it's for you. Take that information and do with it what you will. See if it works for you or it doesn't. And tell me about it if you feel comfortable. Limitations. So many limitations. First of all, because it was a master's, not a PhD. So from the time that the research was approved to be conducted to the time that the dissertation was turned in was 8 months. So the time that I had to recruit people was from January to April, stretching into May, and then I had like a straggler in June. So it wasn't a lot of time to get a lot of people recruited. And the data is not definitive because we need more research. My participant pool is small. I say it was an N equals 5, which means there are 5 participants because those were the people who did not only the pre-survey, but the post-survey. There was one person who did everything except for the post-survey. So in the case of that person, I have to say that there were only 5 people, even though I interviewed 6. And 6 people completed the activities. They did everything but the post survey. Of course, a more in depth analysis of systemic issues that touch on well being for women of color in Ireland is critical. And because, again, like I said in my first video, the term women of color is not accepted by everyone, every woman in Ireland. So language matters. And I leave that to the women of Ireland to decide for themselves how they want to identify. There is a hidden health and wealth problem due to workplace well-being. Like I talked about in my last video, if you do not have the same access to financial well-being as other people, it affects your health. And if you don't have the same access to financial well-being as other people, it carries across the lifespan. It affects your retirement. It affects how you care for your children. It affects how you take care of yourself over the decades and can result in poor health in older age. It also can, if you experience severe racism in the workplace, contribute to weathering, which is a medically validated phenomenon of premature aging due to chronic stress from chronic racism experiences. So it matters. It matters a lot. And we need to, in all societies, be curious, be welcoming, notice what's happening, and don't be so stuck in your own sense of what's happening. It did occur to me that I didn't talk about the themes in my research. So even though I said this is maybe the last video, I won't be able to, I can't not tell you the themes. So there may be another video, but this is a good overview of what the research entailed. And you can take a screenshot, you can zoom in if you're interested in any of the resources that I used today. So leave any questions in the comments. Feel free to ask about positive psychology, about the experience of living in Ireland, about being a graduate student, about writing a dissertation, anything that might be, something that I can share with you. I'll be happy to do that. But thanks for watching.